It started like any other road trip. I had planned to drive from New York to my parents' house in Vermont, a 5-hour drive I had done a dozen times. It's a pretty scenic route, mostly highways and country roads, and the drive is peaceful, even if a little long. I left early, hoping to get there before dark. Everything was fine until I got about halfway through the trip. It was around 3 p.m., and I was driving along this quiet stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. I noticed something strange in the distance, this weird, low mist hanging over the road. It was thick, but it didn't seem like fog, more like smoke or steam. It felt out of place, especially considering it was a warm day. I slowed down, but the mist seemed to follow me, thickening the closer I got. At first, I thought it was just a natural phenomenon, maybe smoke from a nearby fire or some odd weather conditions, but as I drove deeper into it, things started to get off. The air felt colder, and the car's headlights flickered. My radio started acting weird too. One moment it was playing music just fine, and the next it was full of static. I tried to ignore it and keep going, telling myself it was just a glitch. But that's when things started to get seriously weird. Suddenly, my car swerved like I lost control for a second, and I had to quickly steer it back onto the road. I looked around, but there was nothing in the way. No animals, no obstacles, just the road and this unsettling mist. That's when I saw the car ahead of me. It was strange. There was no other car in sight when I first entered the mist, but now there was one, a dark-colored sedan, moving slowly in front of me. I could barely make out its shape, but it looked like it was driving in the same direction I was, about a mile ahead. I sped up, hoping to catch up, maybe pass it and get some clarity on what was going on. But no matter how fast I drove, the car stayed just out of reach. I started to feel uneasy. The road was too quiet. There were no other cars, no signs of life, no houses, no gas stations. Just me, the mist, and that car I couldn't catch. Then I saw it. The car had stopped. Its headlights were on, but it wasn't moving anymore. I slowed down and prepared to pass it, but as I got closer I noticed something chilling. There was no one in the car. I pulled up next to it, my heart racing. I looked inside, but the car was completely empty. The seats were empty, the doors locked. I could see the outline of the steering wheel, the dashboard, but no driver, no passengers, just an empty car in the middle of nowhere. Panicking, I hit the gas and sped past it, glancing in my rearview mirror. The car was still sitting there. It hadn't moved an inch. I drove faster, the mist seeming to get thicker the further I went. And then, just like that, it was gone. The mist lifted, and I could see the clear road again, stretching ahead of me. But I was shaken. I don't know what I had just witnessed, but I wasn't about to stop and find out. By the time I reached my parents' house, the feeling of unease hadn't left me. I told them about the car, but they just brushed it off. They said I'd probably just imagined it. But I know what I saw. There's something about that stretch of road, something off, something otherworldly. I can't explain it, but I know I'll never take that route again. I wish I could just forget it, but the strange thing is, every time I think about that mist, I can still see the empty car in my mind. And every time I close my eyes, it feels like it's still out there, waiting for someone else to drive by. This wasn't the kind of story I thought I'd be telling. I used to travel a lot for work, hopping on planes without a second thought. It was just a regular part of life. But all of that changed after a flight I took about a year ago. I still don't know what happened on that plane, and I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it. I was heading back to the city after a business trip to the West Coast. It was a late night flight, and I was just trying to get some sleep. The flight was a red-eye, and I had my neck pillow, a blanket, and the usual setup for long trips. I was tired but knew I'd be able to sleep through most of it. Everything started out normally. I boarded the plane, found my seat by the window, and settled in. It was a typical full flight with people talking, stewardesses going up and down the aisles, and the usual hum of airplane noise. I remember thinking it was a little warmer than usual, but I didn't think much of it. The trouble began when I tried to sleep. I had just started to drift off when I was suddenly awakened by this strange feeling. It wasn't like being jolted awake from a nightmare. It was more like something was pulling me back to consciousness, like a weight was pushing down on my chest. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the usual low lights of the cabin and hear the hum of the engines. But what I saw was strange. The lights were dimmed, like they should have been, but the air felt heavy, as if the entire cabin had been filled with something dense. The weirdest part was that the people around me seemed off. They weren't looking at their phones or reading. They were just staring straight ahead. No one was talking. Not a single sound, aside from the low murmur of the plane's engines. I rubbed my eyes and glanced around, wondering if I had somehow drifted into some weird dream. But everything was too vivid, too real. I tried to get up, but when I looked at the aisle, it seemed farther away than usual, as if the cabin had stretched. There were no stewardesses walking around, no flight attendants coming by to check on people. I started to feel panicked. I wasn't claustrophobic, but something about the silence, the stillness, it felt wrong. I looked around again, trying to make sense of what was happening, when I noticed something that made my heart stop. In the seat across the aisle, there was a man staring at me, but he wasn't just looking, he was watching. His eyes were wide open, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He wasn't blinking, and his face was completely expressionless. It didn't seem right, like he wasn't even a person. I tried to look away, but something made me lock eyes with him. The more I stared at him, the more I felt like I couldn't move. His gaze seemed to be pulling me in. That's when I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The air felt thinner, the cabin colder. I looked around again. The other passengers were still staring straight ahead, no one moving, no one making a sound. And that man, he didn't blink once. I quickly turned to look out the window, hoping the distraction would help, but instead I saw something I will never forget. The view outside had changed. The city lights I had been expecting to see were gone. Instead, there was just endless darkness, as if the plane was flying through some void. I couldn't breathe. The panic was setting in now. I wanted to stand up, to scream, to do anything, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place. The man across the aisle finally spoke, his voice a low, raspy whisper. He said something I couldn't quite hear, but it felt like it was echoing in my mind, not my ears. It wasn't a language I recognized, but I could understand it somehow. He said, "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't say anything. All I could do was stare back at him. Time seemed to stretch in the strangest way. I couldn't tell if minutes or hours had passed. The air felt so dense I could barely catch my breath. And then just like that, it was gone. The silence lifted. The cabin returned to normal. People started talking again, and the flight attendants walked down the aisle, handing out drinks. The man who had been staring at me, he was gone. Not just out of sight, he wasn't anywhere. It was like he had never existed. I looked around at the other passengers. They were all acting normal, talking to each other, completely unaware of what had just happened. I wanted to ask someone, anyone, if they had seen what I had seen. But I didn't. I was too shaken. Eventually I landed, but something was different. The feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the sensation that I had just experienced something that wasn't real, or maybe was real, but not in the way I understood reality. I never saw that man again, but I also never forgot him. I don't know what happened during that flight, and I can't explain it, but whenever I think about that experience, I get the sense that I've crossed a line, that maybe I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. The strangest part? I haven't been able to get on a plane since. Every time I even think about flying, I feel that same unease, that same chill. I don't know what that man was or what he wanted, but I know I don't want to find out. All I know is that sometimes flights aren't just about getting from one place to another. Sometimes they're about something much darker, something that follows you even after you land. This happened a couple of years ago, and I still can't fully explain it. I was on a road trip, just me and my car, driving down a desolate stretch of highway through the desert. I had planned it to be a relaxing getaway, just a simple trip to clear my head and enjoy some quiet time away from the noise of the city. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. I was headed toward a small town for an overnight stay. There wasn't much in the way of civilization for miles, just open desert, the occasional gas station, and very few cars on the road. I had gotten a late start, but it didn't seem like a big deal. I had a full tank of gas and plenty of snacks. Besides, I like driving at night. The roads are emptier, and there's something oddly peaceful about the quiet. It started out fine, just the low hum of my car on the asphalt and the soft tunes playing in the background. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the barren landscape. For miles, the only thing I could see were the occasional cacti, rocks, and the dark expanse of the desert. The quiet was comforting, but it started to feel too quiet. About halfway through the drive, I noticed something strange. Up ahead, about a mile or so, I saw headlights. This wasn't unusual in itself after all. It's a highway. But there was something off about these headlights. For one, they were moving very erratically. It didn't seem like a normal car driving down the road. It was weaving from one side of the lane to the other, almost as if the driver couldn't control it. At first, I figured it was just a drunk driver or someone who was tired. But as I got closer, I realized there was no way it could be that. The car, if it even was a car, didn't seem to be on the road at all. It was hovering just above the pavement, swerving in an unnatural way. I slowed down, my curiosity getting the better of me. I was a little hesitant, but my instinct told me to keep going. The headlights were getting closer, and I could see the shape of the vehicle more clearly. It was a dark sedan, but it looked wrong. There were no license plates, no visible signs of a make or model. It didn't even have the standard reflective lights on the rear. Suddenly, it swerved toward me, coming too close to my lane. My heart pounded in my chest as I swerved to avoid it, my tires screeching as I barely kept control of the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the sedan behind me, but there was nothing. Just the empty, endless highway behind me. I looked ahead again, but the sedan was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there at all. I shook my head, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the shadows of the desert making everything look weirder than it really was. I tried to shake it off and continued driving, but I couldn't stop glancing around. The silence around me had deepened. The road seemed longer now, the stretch ahead of me more endless than it had been before, and that's when I heard a faint sound, almost like a whisper. At first I thought I had imagined it, but it came again, louder this time. It was a voice not in the car, but outside, floating through the open window. It was a soft voice, just barely audible, almost as if it was calling out to me from the dark. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded pleading. I froze. My foot hovered over the gas pedal as I tried to listen. The voice came again, more distinct this time. It sounded like a woman, her voice strained and desperate, but I still couldn't understand what she was saying. I slammed the car to a stop, my heart racing as I looked around. There was nothing on the side of the road, no sign of anyone. Just the open desert stretching out under the moonlight. I turned the engine off, straining to listen. The wind outside was the only sound now, and that faint whispering still hung in the air. I didn't know what to do. I had to keep going, but a part of me was too afraid to move. The whispers grew louder, clearer this time. I could hear the words now, or at least part of them. It was something like, "Help me. You have to help me." That was enough to make me snap back into reality. My hands were shaking as I turned the ignition and put my car into gear. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't about to sit there and wait for whatever was happening to catch up with me. I floored the gas pedal, and the car roared to life, the engine breaking the silence as I sped down the highway. The whispering died away as the speed picked up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was out there, something watching me. I drove for what felt like hours, the lights of the little town in the distance finally coming into view. It wasn't until I pulled into the parking lot of my hotel that I started to feel like I was safe. The familiar lights of the town and the hum of the local traffic were a welcome relief after the unsettling experience on the highway. I parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady. It was then that I noticed something strange. My car's rearview mirror, there was something written on it. In the condensation that had formed on the glass, there was a faint message. "I'm still here." I didn't know how it got there or who had written it, but I knew one thing: whatever had been following me on that highway wasn't going to let me go that easily. I didn't want to think about it, but I knew I had been touched by something I couldn't explain. I stayed in that town for the night, and I didn't drive anywhere for the rest of my trip. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me on the road. The car ride was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and I still don't know if it was some kind of paranormal encounter or if my mind had just gone off the rails. But I do know that I'll never look at a deserted highway the same way again. And if I ever go back to that area, you can bet I'll be taking a different route. There are some things, some roads that are better left unexplored. I've always had a thing for traveling, whether it's road trips, flights, or even short weekend getaways. But there's one trip that stands out in my mind, and it's not for the reasons you might think. It was a late-night red-eye flight from New York to California. I had booked it last minute, needing to be on the West Coast for business, and let's just say it's not a flight I'll ever forget. The flight wasn't full, which was a relief because I had the entire row to myself. I settled in, tucked my bag under the seat, and plugged my headphones in, ready to relax and maybe get a few hours of sleep. The flight attendants went through their usual routine safety demonstration, checking seat belts and asking for any special requests. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was about 30 minutes into the flight when I started to feel something strange. The cabin was unusually quiet. I mean, it's a red-eye, so it's expected, but this was different. The air felt heavier, almost as if something was weighing down on the plane. I tried to shake it off and looked around. Everyone was either asleep or staring blankly ahead. No one was talking, and the usual sounds of the plane, a low hum of the engine, seemed muffled. Then I felt it. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't feel right. I looked around again, trying to brush off the feeling. Maybe it was just the lack of sleep catching up with me, or maybe it was the quiet atmosphere, but the unease only grew stronger. As the plane soared over the darkened landscape below, I tried to focus on my music, hoping it would drown out the feeling of dread creeping up. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It wasn't much, just a shift in the aisle, like someone had passed by. I glanced over, but the aisle was empty. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was another flight attendant moving around, or maybe I had just imagined it. A few minutes later I saw it again, this time, much clearer. A figure, tall and gaunt, walking slowly down the aisle. My heart skipped a beat, and my hands gripped the armrest tightly. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a shadowy shape moving between the seats. It didn't walk like a person. There was something off about its movements, like it was floating more than walking. I quickly glanced at the passengers around me, but no one seemed to notice. It was as if they were in a trance, staring straight ahead, not reacting to anything. The figure passed by me and kept going toward the front of the plane. I wanted to call out to the flight attendants, but I couldn't find my voice. It was like the air itself had thickened, and I couldn't breathe properly. When I looked back, the figure was gone, but I swear I could still feel its presence, lingering in the space. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. My body felt paralyzed with fear. I wanted to call the flight attendant, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I could barely focus on anything except the eerie silence and the overwhelming sense of dread that had filled the cabin. The next few minutes felt like hours. I kept telling myself that it was all in my head, that I was just too tired, but I couldn't get rid of the unsettling sensation. And then, as if on cue, the overhead lights flickered. I thought it was just a glitch, maybe a plane malfunction, but the lights went out entirely for a brief moment. When they came back on, everything seemed even more distorted. The cabin looked darker, and the faces of the passengers seemed different almost. Hollow. The flight attendants continued their routine as if nothing had happened. They moved up and down the aisles, but I couldn't bring myself to ask them if they had seen anything unusual. They looked so normal, so detached from what was happening. I kept waiting for someone else to react, to acknowledge the strange tension in the air, but no one did. It wasn't long before I noticed that the cabin seemed emptier. It wasn't physically less crowded, but it felt like the souls of the people around me had just disappeared. I looked over to my left, and there was a man sitting in the seat next to mine. I didn't recall him boarding the plane, but there he was, staring out of the window. His face was pale, almost ghostly. I tried to speak to him, but my voice didn't seem to come out right, almost as if my words were being swallowed by the very air itself. I reached out to tap his shoulder, but as soon as my hand made contact, he vanished into thin air. I jolted back, my pulse racing. It wasn't just a weird dream or sleep paralysis. I was wide awake, fully aware of what was happening around me, but I couldn't explain any of it. I thought maybe I was just going crazy from exhaustion, but something told me that wasn't the case. The air was still thick, heavy with something unexplainable. I had to get out of there. I couldn't wait until the plane landed, so I decided to head to the bathroom to calm myself down. I figured if I just got up and moved around, I'd snap out of whatever weird funk I was in. But as I stood up, I noticed that the aisle seemed longer than before. I looked down at the floor and noticed the tiles were slightly different, like they didn't belong there. My feet felt heavier as I walked, and every step seemed to echo unnaturally loud. I wasn't imagining it. The plane wasn't right. As I made my way to the bathroom, I passed a row of empty seats. I glanced over, and that's when I saw a figure sitting in one of the seats, facing me. It was a woman, but her face was obscured, covered by her dark hair. I could feel her eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I tried to look away, but my body wouldn't move. The air seemed to press down on me, making it difficult to breathe. Suddenly, the figure stood up and moved toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I had to get away from her. I turned and bolted toward the bathroom, not looking back. When I finally reached the bathroom, I locked the door behind me and took a moment to collect myself. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop hyperventilating. I tried to convince myself that I had just imagined everything, that it was just the exhaustion and the stress of travel getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. I spent the remainder of the journey as far away from the aisles as possible, keeping my head down and my eyes glued to the window. By the time we landed, I was physically and mentally drained, and I couldn't wait to get off the plane. I don't know what happened on that flight, and I don't know if anyone else experienced what I did, but when I stepped off that plane, I never looked at flying the same way again. Something was on that plane with me, something that didn't belong, and I hope I never cross paths with it again. I've taken many flights since then, but every time I board a plane, I can't shake the feeling that something is lingering, waiting in the shadows. And every time the lights flicker or the cabin gets too quiet, I remember that red-eye flight. And I wonder, was I the only one who noticed? There was something.